Why did England send ships to Australia in 1788? What was going on?
The jails were overcrowded, is the short answer. So they'd lost the American colonies in 1776, and by 1788 it was a hot political issue. You've got to remember that the death sentence was passed on criminals in that era for even trivial crimes. So you had thousands and thousands of people on death row, and the jails were just terrible. They were in a disgraceful condition. And as is the wont of politicians, they wanted a sort of a convenient way out. So rather than pursuing prison reform, which by the way is what evangelical Christians of the day, including John Wesley, were advocating, said, well, that's a bit hard and expensive, let's ship them offshore. There's that continent that James Cook discovered for us back in 1770. We'll send New South Wales, as it was called then, let's send them there to Botany Bay, our excess convicts. And it was seen as a deterrent. It was seen as a fate almost worse than death to be sent to Botany Bay, although they abandoned Botany Bay within a week and came up to Port Jackson.
Yeah. Quick question about the law.
Yeah.
Why were there so many death sentences? Like, in the sense that I hear there was like 200 crimes, and they were mostly crimes against landholders.
Correct.
Why that?
Look, England, Britain in general, was a deeply class-ridden society, and it really was an evil decade, the 18th century. Crimes against property were taken extremely seriously. There'd been a movement for a couple of centuries where the peasants were being driven off the land by the enclosure movement and driven into the cities where industrialisation was sort of beginning to take off. That led to urban overcrowding and crime. Yeah. Crime on a large scale.
And there's no safety net in that system, is there?
No safety net whatsoever. So you either starved or stole.
Wow.
Most of the convicts on the First Fleet were there for offences against property. There were a few hardcore criminals. The class of criminals got worse as the years went on, actually, but the early fleets were full of petty thieves and petty fraudsters and prostitutes.
Wow. Why was Richard Johnson the first chaplain, and he's on the boats and arrives with the fleet in 1788? Why was he in that fleet?
He was appointed as the chaplain to the fleet, the official Church of England representative. He actually owed his appointment to some very big names. William Wilberforce, who was a very influential Tory reformist evangelical politician, and John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. You know, these were huge figures in that era, 1780s. And they looked ahead a bit. They were visionaries. They could see that, well, look, this is a penal colony, but nevertheless, it's a new land, and we want to have a Christian presence there. And a chaplain, he was an evangelical, by the way, not from the dominant high church establishment wing of the Church of England. He was a Yorkshireman and connected with what became the Clapham sect, and a very conscientious man. He was 34 when he arrived.
What do you think? What was his motivation? Just because John Newton sends him a letter and says you should go, and he thinks that's a great idea? Because it must have been a huge decision to come this far.
Unimaginable, really. The distance involved a perilous journey. There was no guarantee you'd arrive alive, of course. But he saw it as his duty. He was asked by these eminent senior Christian figures to volunteer, and he did.
When Richard Johnson got here, what was his role once he got here?
Well, that was controversial because the first few governors, including Philip, he was a fine man but not a fervently religious man, regarded his role as maintaining morality and public order, a morals policeman. That was what Philip wanted him to do. And really, the first few governors, that's what they wanted him to do. But those who sent him, of course, wanted him to go further than that. For a start, he had all his duties as a minister, so baptisms, marriages, funerals, prayers for the sick and those about to be executed. That was a lot of his time. And conducting services. He conducted one within a few days of arriving. Then there was the evangelical role. Johnson regarded himself as a failure in that regard. And frankly, he didn't have a lot of outward success with the convicts, who were a pretty rough and ready bunch. But he actually built the first church in Sydney out of his own funds. He couldn't persuade Philip to pay for one, so he paid for it himself. The convicts burnt it down within about a year. I mean, that's what he was up against. He had a tough gig. He was also, though, a very charitable man. So contemporaneous records by convicts record that he generously gave away his own food and provisions to keep people alive, tended to the sick who came in subsequent fleets. He thought himself a failure, but when he returned to England in 1800, but he wasn't. He was a success. In very, very difficult circumstances.
Roy, thank you.
Thank you, Karl. Yeah.